So let's go ahead and start out with Minnesota, where almost 100 mayors called out Governor Walz because of his incompetence. Take a look.
So now almost 100 Minnesota mayors have written to Governor Walz and state lawmakers. Quote, fraud, unchecked spending, and inconsistent fiscal management in St. Paul have trickled down to our cities, reducing our capacity to plan responsibly, maintain infrastructure, hire and retain employees, and sustain core services without overburdening local taxpayers.
But Governor Walz is not taking responsibility for any of the crime, any of the corruption, any of the fraud. Instead, he's placing the blame on local government. Listen to this.
But you hear what Governor Walz is saying, Mayor Purfirst. He's saying, this is up to like the local, the local management here. And he's taking the blame off of himself as governor. What do you say to that?
Martha, that is just absurd. I mean, Minnesotans have been fleeced to the tune of $9 billion. This is done from fraud right out of the Minnesota Capitol in St. Paul, as well as the policies that are being championed and brought across the finish line by the legislature. Both the legislature and the governor are at fault for the fraud and the constant policies that are taxing Minnesotans.
This shouldn't be a surprise to anybody because throughout this whole process where the fraud was identified, Governor Walz has refused to take any responsibility whatsoever. The House Oversight Committee is not going to bring in state employees. They're going to bring in state lawmakers and try to figure out exactly how deep the fraud actually goes. Listen to this.
So let's bring in now Chairman James Coper. He leads the charge over at Oversight, and he joins us now. Good morning to you. Tell us about who you're bringing in, who you want to see on Capitol Hill, and what questions do you want to ask them?
Well, the most important people are the state whistleblowers, the state employees who put that tweet out that we all are familiar with a few weeks ago that alerted America to the massive fraud. These state employees also allege that they had warned both Governor Walz and Attorney General Ellison for years that this fraud was occurring, and yet nothing was taking place. So we're going to bring the state employees in. We're going to get their sworn testimony. We appreciate their bravery in coming forward. We're also going to bring in state lawmakers and Minnesota mayors because the walls are caving in on Tim Walz. This massive amount of fraud is affecting and impacting every citizen of Minnesota because they're having to cut services because so much of the money for social programs was wasted and defrauded by this Somali population. So these are the people we're going to bring in. We're going to try to identify who was responsible for this. We're going to try to identify banks that we can subpoena their bank records so we can follow the money to see how much was taken, who took it, and then who do we need to hold accountable, and hopefully we'll have some criminal referrals at the end of the investigation.
I think the most important part about that clip that I just played is the fact that social programs that are supposed to serve Minnesotans right now don't have enough funds to operate. And why don't they have the funds to operate? Not because they weren't there initially, but because these funds were sent overseas. They were used to buy luxury condos, luxury vehicles, buy jewelry, and even potentially be funding al-Shabaab back in Somalia, helping destabilize the same country where people are trying to flee to come to this country. I think most Americans are feeling betrayed right now because I said this in a previous episode. We opened up our home to the Somali population to come here from a devastated, from a war-torn country. And instead of assimilating into American society, getting an education, working, doing whatever they could to contribute back to this country that gave them so much, what they did was they robbed us blind. We're talking about billions of dollars that were supposed to support Minnesotans going back to Somalia. Make that make sense. But again, instead of taking responsibility and saying, you know what, I'm the governor of this state, I'm responsible for everything that happens here, understand that I wasn't directly connected to a lot of this, but ultimately the buck stops with me. He didn't do that. Instead, Governor Walz is disputing the amount of fraud.
What you're seeing here is you're seeing a weaponization. We'll continue to fix it. They're going to continue to come up with numbers that don't have it there, and it's sensationalized. I don't expect anything different from this administration.
The amount of fraud is important, but the fact that the fraud occurred is even more important. And in case you just showed up to the party and you're now learning about this fraud in Minnesota and are curious on exactly what the money was used for, take a listen here.
Put up on screen here. This is the $9 billion in Minnesota fraud schemes. So on the left-hand side is what this money was supposed to be for. And we'll go tight on here so you can see it. Feeding children, helping recovering addicts, helping disabled adults. This was during COVID for the most part. But the money went to wire transfers to China and East Africa, a villa in the Maldives, luxury vehicles, and designer jewelry. You can see the list here.
I think the only thing left to do for Governor Walz, Ilhan Omar, and any other lawmakers that may be implicated in this massive fraud scandal is to try to distract, try to deflect from the massive fraud scandal. And what better way to do that than to stick to what everybody's looking at right now, which is deportation and ICE.
It's not about keeping people safe. It's about generating fear.
Surrounded by state and faith leaders at Shiloh Temple in Minneapolis, Governor Tim Walz says President Trump is using federal agents to target states he has a political fight against. Because of that, he says he's expecting more ICE activity over the holidays.
I would tell you, if I were a betting person, they will do it over these holiday seasons because it makes it especially cruel.
I think Governor Walz is right on this one. President Trump is targeting his state. He's targeting a lot of the blue states. But why is he targeting a lot of these blue states? Because within these states, you have sanctuary cities. Where are these criminals headed? They're heading to these sanctuary cities because they know they're going to be protected there. That is why President Trump is focusing on those cities. Look, I'm going to give you some numbers that I gave you before. During Trump's first administration, 90% of people that came into this country didn't have a criminal record, here or back at home. During the Biden administration, 94% of the people that came into this country did not have a criminal record, here or back at home. But if you add the numbers, if you do simple math, and let's say 10 million people came into this country illegally, and you say 6% had a criminal record, that's 600,000 criminals that came into this country. Of course, most people that come here don't have criminal records. But the fact of the matter is that people are here legally. And what have I said before? If you don't like people getting deported, change the law. How do you change the law? Change the politician. It's simple. We have laws in this nation that need to be enforced. Now, do I feel bad when I see people getting deported that don't have a criminal record and that have been here for decades and decades working? Of course, I feel terrible. But the laws are the laws, and they need to be followed. Once again, change the laws if you don't like them. Now, let me tell you something that the Trump administration does terribly. Messaging. You have people saying the Trump administration is racist, they're bigoted, they're transphobic, and a number of other things that are false. So let's start with one of the most common misperceptions about the Trump administration. The first one being that he hates anybody that's gay, lesbian, transgender, that he is transphobic, and all of this is false. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, is openly gay. As a matter of fact, he's the first openly gay Secretary of the Treasury. So let's talk about the second falsehood when it comes to the Trump administration, which is that he hates Hispanic people. That is completely false. Remember, we have the first Hispanic Secretary of State, which is one of the most important positions in this country right now. And not only was he confirmed, but he was confirmed unanimously. That is the first time that's happened in modern history. So for those that say that President Trump hates anybody that's gay, anybody that's lesbian, that he hates Hispanics, those are two perfect examples that counter that. The difference between who President Trump assigns and who President Joe Biden assigned is the fact that Joe Biden assigned people based on the fact that they were first. The first Hispanic to serve in this position, the first black person to serve in this position, the first woman to serve in this position. That is not how we should be assigning people. Assignment should be based on merit. If you look at those two individuals, the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of State, those are two highly qualified individuals. Now, one thing that President Trump was doing that I completely disagreed with was deploying the National Guard to our cities. The National Guard cannot enforce civil laws. They cannot make arrests. They can't do any law enforcement operations. That is against the United States Constitution. Now, if there is a national emergency, for example, in Los Angeles where you had riots, that's different. But in most cases, the president just simply wants to deploy the troops to support law enforcement operations, and we can't do that. So the Supreme Court just handed down a judgment that says that he cannot deploy the American military into our cities for civil law enforcement operations. And I completely agree with that.
The Supreme Court has dealt a significant blow to the Trump administration, blocking the president from deploying the National Guard to Chicago. In the 6-3 ruling, the court's 3 liberal justices were joined by Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And today's decision could jeopardize Guard deployments in other cities.
Look, the law is clear. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 restricts the military from engaging in any type of law enforcement operations, any type of civil law enforcement operations, and I completely agree with it. They cannot make routine arrests, conduct any searches, enforce civilian laws, and I don't think the military should be playing any role in civil enforcement operations.
Very difficult for the president to justify the National Guard in Portland, New York, anywhere else.
Explain why this mattered in Chicago, but didn't play in Los Angeles or in Portland, Oregon, where the Guard was also deployed.
So I think you and I discussed Los Angeles and D.C. were different. D.C. was different. Trump was allowed generally to deploy there because the president is in charge of the D.C. National Guard, okay? Put that to the side. L.A. was different, Los Angeles, because there were protests that at times turned violent happening there. The rationale in Chicago is much more generalized. Just, well, crime rates are high and it's very dangerous. And the Supreme Court has said that's not enough for this specific statute.
I think what President Trump is doing now is trying to buy time. I think he's trying to buy time until DHS Secretary Noem, hires the number of ICE agents that they need to engage in these enforcement operations in a safe manner and grow the force to about 30,000 agents as a whole. You know, one thing that must be mentioned here is that DHS is doing a pretty good job of getting people to just leave on their own. What they've done is they've used the CBP app to now allow people to leave. Remember, they gave a $1,000 bonus for those who self-deported before. And now for the holidays, what they're doing is giving a $3,000 bonus for those who self-deport.
The Trump White House now offering $3,000 to undocumented immigrants to self-deport by the end of this month. Now that right there, that is triple the $1,000 stipend that was offered since May. DHS officials say even with this bonus bump, you could call it, it is a significant savings for American taxpayers. Officials have previously said it costs an average of about $17,000 to arrest, detain, and remove just one undocumented immigrant.
Raise your hand. We'll help you get home. We'll facilitate it, and you might get the chance to come back to this country the right way someday. If you wait until we interdict you and detain you and arrest you and have to deport you ourselves, you'll never get the chance to come back.
And for those of you that are curious if paying people to leave actually works, yes, it does. 1.6 million people have already self-deported through the CBP app. Another 300,000 have self-deported on their own. ICE has deported about 622,000. So in total, about 2.5 million people have either self-deported or have been deported by ICE. And this has all happened in a span of a year. 2.5 million people self-deporting or being deported in the span of 1 year. Doesn't that make you question how many people came in through the open borders policy of the previous administration? We cannot just have them come into this country unvetted. It just doesn't work like that. As a society, it creates a critical problem. So now let's move on to the Epstein files. The Department of Justice is dragging their asses when it comes to releasing these files, which only makes the Trump administration look even worse. Take a look.
Justice Department has now released a big new batch of documents in the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, and these include new details about Epstein's one-time friendship with President Trump. Look, there is a lot to go through. We said it's like more than 10,000 pages, so we are digging through this. But this is what is seen so far. In a 2020 email, an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York wrote that Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet, quote, more times than previously has been reported, at least 8 times between 1993 and 96. And on a flight in 1993, according to the email, there was just 3 passengers, Trump, Epstein, and what's described as a 20-year-old woman. Being mentioned in a trove of investigatory documents does not demonstrate criminal wrongdoing, a reminder, and Trump has not been accused of being involved in Epstein's crimes. On Monday, the president did seem dismayed that the release of any and all of these files, though, could harm the reputations of individuals he said, quote, innocently met Epstein. Now, remember, he is the man who also signed into law last month, a measure requiring the Justice Department to do just this, release the files.
A lot of people are very angry that pictures are being released of other people that really had nothing to do with Epstein, but they're in a picture with him because he was at a party, and you ruin the reputation of somebody.
Do you guys notice that when CNN talks about Trump and the Epstein files, they do it in a way that insinuates that Trump is guilty of wrongdoing? Am I the only one that gets that feeling? Now, I'm not saying Trump is innocent. What I'm saying is that every time that they cover this, and this is the reason why they're saying that they're afraid of releasing some of these names, because the press sensationalizes everything. If you don't know what I'm talking about, take a listen here.
We're just getting started, but the headline here is quite clear. Donald Trump is all over these documents. In that first trove that the Justice Department released on Friday, there were just a few very scant mentions of Trump, including in a picture collected with a bunch of other pictures. In this one, there is already one very illuminating email that was sent during the first presidency of Donald Trump while prosecutors in the Southern District of New York were working on the case against Epstein co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell. This is after Epstein's death. And one of those prosecutors writes, I'm going to read from this letter because it is what was new to the prosecutors at the time and what is new to us now, receiving these documents now in the public sphere from the Justice Department. The prosecutor, unnamed, an assistant U.S. attorney of the Southern District of New York, wrote on January 8th of 2020, the flight records we received yesterday reflect that Donald Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet many more times than previously has been reported or that we were aware. That's the Justice Department in 2020, including during the period we would expect to charge in a Maxwell case.
Did you guys see that, or am I going crazy here? They make it sound like he's completely incriminated. Let me tell you, if President Trump would have been in these files in a incriminating manner, he wouldn't be president right now. Joe Biden would have released this, they would have made it public, and he would never have taken office again. What other billionaires are you hearing about? I don't hear about anybody else. The only person that I hear about is Trump. Who else has CNN spoken about that's relevant? But I'll say it again, the DOJ needs to do a better job of releasing these files. They shouldn't have anything to hide. Release all the files. And if they don't, they're going to continue to get lawmakers to push them to do it. Listen to this.
Many members of Congress are pushing the Justice Department to release all of the remaining files related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. On Friday, the DOJ released thousands of pages of documents, but take a look at your screen. CBS News found at least 550 pages were fully redacted. Some lawmakers are criticizing the move, saying all of the files should have been released in accordance with a law signed earlier this year. The Justice Department says that was to protect the innocent. Over the weekend, we heard from the bipartisan sponsors who led the push in the House to release the files. Here's what they told our Margaret Brennan about the partial release.
They sent a 6-page memo to Congress and said they cited pre-existing laws as reasons that they weren't going to follow our law. For instance, our law requires them to release information regardless of embarrassment, but they are trying to say that a previous law prevails when it doesn't.
The problem is this was a slap in the face of survivors. What do they want? They want to know who are the rich and powerful men who visited Epstein's rape island and covered up the abuse. And the key documents that our law basically said needed to be released, the 60-count indictment that actually implicates a lot of these people, and the prosecution memo were not released. It's not about the timeline, it's about the selective concealment.
I think the lawmakers have the right to be frustrated. The previous law supersedes this law. What are they talking about? Congress just passed something that says that all these files need to be released. Why aren't they released? Every day that passes that they fail to release these files makes the Trump administration look even more guilty. Even if President Trump isn't incriminated, people are going to start questioning the validity of these files. I'm questioning the validity of these files right now. I think everybody that was involved with molesting these kids, with abusing these kids, should be in jail right now. And you know, one of the funny things is the fact that they released pictures of Bill Clinton with girls and Epstein before. I don't see that all over the news now. Look, I think everybody that was involved with Epstein in a way that was criminal should be in jail right now. Everybody needs to be in jail. And I think the Trump administration needs to do a better job of releasing these files. All right, tell me in the comments below what you guys think about the Epstein files and the DOJ slow walking the release of the files. Let me also think what you think about the Supreme Court judgment that prohibits President Trump from deploying the National Guard into our cities. And also let me know, who do you think is ultimately responsible for the fraud that happened in Minnesota? Like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, stay balanced.